This is Talking Hardcore, the podcast for people who love hardcore history.
You study history because it allows us to understand the present and prepare for the future.
I'm not trolling.
And I love it.
I'm
I'm here
just
for
pointing out where they're wrong.
The Talking Hardcore podcast is presented by Ace Industrial Solutions. Are you in need of skilled trade professionals for your next project? Look no further. Specializing in commercial and industrial buildouts, floor coatings and coverings, high-speed concrete polish, floor cleaning, shot blasting, painting, energy efficiency, and pallet racking. With a proven track record of excellence, they have become the industry leader. To find out more, please check the link in the description. Hi, everybody. You're watching Talking Hardcore. I'm George.
I'm Scott.
And we're here today with Dr. Will Reilly.
Riley.
I'm terrible with names. I always read it on Twitter. That's the problem. So I never actually hear it said very often. And anyway, Dr. Reilly's here with us today. We're going to call him Will. He is one of the best Twitter follows you could find. Always posting interesting studies and sources and arguments. So if you want to follow any of the woke culture war stuff, Will is a great follow. The link in the description of the video. Anyway, Doc, thanks for coming on.
Yep.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So the reason I reached out is because I saw that you also are follow hardcore history, and so Scott and I, we like hardcore history. Dan Carlin hardcore history, and when I saw that you also follow him, I thought, obviously he likes history. Let's talk history. And then lately, there's been all this stuff about the Roman Empire, and then your tweets about, oh, the Roman Empire is for sissies. It's all about the Mongols. I'm paraphrasing, right? The real men think about the Mongols. Hits hard because my favorite Dan Carlin is Wrath of Khans, and the Mongols are fascinating. So let's get into your take on that first, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know if I expected that to be the first question, but I'm up to defend the Mongol Empire. What I said on Twitter was that the whole thing, first of all, I think that this was an example of kind of, let me loosen the suit button here.
You can drop the tie if you're more comfortable too.
I wear a suit to teach, so I'm comfortable wearing it now. It's just a little tight. But basically what I said was that first, the whole, like, does your man think about the Roman Empire thing was kind of funny to me because it just indicates the sexes sometimes have problems communicating. So, yeah, I mean, obviously there are a lot of guys that have these quirky, often historical interests. I mean, men are 95% of the visitors to different battlefields. And I mean, most people even today have a job that would break down to merchant, you know, you're in business, you're stock guy or ads guy or whatever, or warrior, right. You're a soldier, sailor. So there's an interest in the history and the development of those things. And the idea that people just had never asked their boyfriend, like, what are you thinking about? Or their girlfriend. And that's a meme, right? The two people are laying in bed thinking completely different random shit.
Yeah.
Like, that he's cheating. And the guy's like, Caesar was the first of the real Caesars. You know, I thought this was like a real life illustration of that. So I said that. But then I also said, I mean, like, I think that the Roman Empire is kind of the Merlot of, like, guy historical interests. Like, obviously, it's great. It's the baseline every time you eat a steak. But I mean, I said, like, the Mongol Empire was far more impressive in terms of land area. And then I said, like, for all the, like, Hotep and, like, dissident right types on Twitter, like, do you guys know anything about, like, the Aryan invasion or the Bantu migration? Like, not endorsing those philosophies, but, you know, like, know your history, friend. You know,
right. Yeah.
And all that kind of thing. And that actually drew a pretty big response. Like, there apparently is, like, Roman Defender Twitter. So all these people were like, yeah, none of those people, the Bantu and the Vikings didn't beat the phalanxes of Greece at Cynocephali. And it was like, kind of, you know, some of you guys might want to log off a little bit more. And it's funny when I say that. But yeah, it was just an interesting kind of conversation.
Like they have a dog in that fight.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
dogs hid in that fight. Ancient Greek.
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, go ahead.
No, oh yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, that was pretty much it. That was the conversation, and I think there are like probably 10 or 12 of those kind of niche interests. You know, not even really niche. Like when you get to the Civil War, World War II, the spy game. You know, Britain versus Russia in the Kipling era. Like there are a bunch of things. I have friends that will buy every book about. You know, so.
Yep, anything that says Nazi on it sells like crazy. You know, but one of the things that if Roman are the Merlot, does that make the the Khans, Mongols, like moonshine.
No, it's Johnny Walker.
Yeah, maybe they'd be like a good sweet wine or something. They'd be a more niche taste, whatever. I mean, like they good
Okay.
Chardonnay or something.
I
But I mean,
gotcha.
like, yeah, the Mongol Empire, obviously, I think is one of those things that Westerners kind of know about at the periphery, but
Right.
aren't really all that familiar with. And I mean, like, none of these are actually my era of historical geekiness as versus, for example, like early American history or the Aztecs, the Bantu migration or something. But like, I've read a lot about the Mongols. I read the book The Horde recently. And, the Mongols conquered, Russia, China, India, if you extend them to the Mongols, Persia. I mean, like, Genghis Khan and his immediate descendants came closer to conquering the world than anyone ever has. 2% of all living men, 8% of Asian men are descended from Genghis Khan. So that's God level behavior to some extent. The Romans would have deified him.
Literally, yeah.
And that brings me to a point that George and I think it was our first episode. Who do you think was, if you wanted to say the worst person in history, according to like deaths and destruction?
Oh, no. According to whatever it is you judge to be worst.
Sure. Who do you think would be the worst person? And the three
of all time.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that question is entirely, it's a great question, but I'm not sure it's entirely relevant because morals, like gets into a whole philosophical conversation. Morality.
Well, let's have it.
Yeah, sure. But morality to me isn't objectively real. And I'm not saying that in an edgelord sense. Like there's obviously a human empathic sense. There are things, if you saw someone stomp a puppy to death or rape a baby or something, many people would want to hurt or kill him, myself included, presumably including you guys. But the rules much beyond that, beyond like don't eat people and don't rape tribes, women, and so on. Like the actual 10 commandments they have in anthropology and no incest are largely constructed at the individual societal level. And in like my field of political science, that's not really even debated. So, I mean, like a civilized Arab, Japanese, and Westerner are all, people from fabulously wealthy, equal competitor societies that are perhaps flying on Air France together, but have completely different conceptions of virtually everything, like the social role of women, the legality of drugs, private ownership of firearms, so on down the line. So I guess where I'm going with all this is that, like, the idea that you shouldn't kill your enemies, take their land, drive their women before you and hear their lamentations, all that, this dates back to, like, 1954.
Exactly.
Like, literally, the right of conquest was abolished. We integrated the United States, like all those, like, we don't fight the other man that looks different from us and has a different flag. That idea is like 70 years old. So when you talk about like the worst people in history, like almost all of them would have been considered the greatest people in history by very honorable people until very recently. So when people say like who has the highest body count, is it Caesar, Cortez, Shaka Zulu, Genghis Khan? Genghis Khan's ahead of those other three. I mean, but like so on down the line, those are generally considered to be four of the greatest human leaders. Like they established entire nations and so on. So I'm not sure if I were going to describe someone as the worst, it would have to be someone who most violated the moral rules of their time. And also
that's because I try to look at it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I don't really, even I don't care that much about that. They had to violate the moral rules of their time and also do harm. So, I mean, they kind of had to lose. Like, no one calls Hitler the Great today because he idiotically started a war with the USA and the British Empire and Russia.
So Will says I'm right.
No, well,
because Genghis didn't lose, so he can't be the worst person of all time. That's who he argued. I said no way he's worse than Hitler or Stalin.
Wait a minute.
Those guys kind of lost. So I'm right. Thanks, Doc.
Let's
appreciate
clarify the statement. Now, how about this? One thing, I guess this was unspoken in my mind. Who was the worst person in history according to today's morals? That would be.
And that's not I know it doesn't apply,
but when we had that conversation, so Dan Carlin's first episode was Hitler versus Alexander, and so he was making a play on which one was worse or better, and I said, well, what about Genghis Khan? He definitely killed and raped and pillaged his way across a large swath of the planet
more than anybody.
Yeah, so that's why Genghis was at the top of my list.
Sure.
Morals aside, modern morals aside, same thing with Alexander. Was he actually the Great? Well, he wasn't the Great until the Romans dubbed him Alexander the Great.
Right.
At least that's what I recall.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
but thanks for indulging us in this discussion.
What were you going to say, Will?
Yeah, so I mean, like, what I would say, and again, the worst person in history by today's moral standards is kind of a tough question because every great leader didn't care about their enemies and so killed a shitload of them. I mean, the idea that you should care about people you don't like or know, I'm not sure I believe that today. I mean, that's an extremely narrow slice of history. Like, by modern moral standards, Genghis would be up there, but I mean, like, maybe Tamerlane. But any of the great kings of the past, like you'd also like Babur the Conqueror, the guy that conquered India. Muslims technically believe that there are people of the book who are almost as good as Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the generality of Muslims. And then they're just pagan savages. So Babur the Conqueror thought the Hindus were pagan savages and so killed, I think, 40 million people. If you had to make a
Wow.
top five,
I have to look into him. I have never heard of him.
Yeah, well, we haven't heard of a lot of the guys from the East, I think, in the West. So,
right.
And that leads to almost funny things where people say, like, well, Buddhism's very peaceful. And, like, if Genghis prayed to anything but his sword, he was probably a Buddhist. The best fighting men in the world are Gurkhas from Nepal. They're all Buddhist. We think that because we don't live around a lot of fucking Buddhists. So, I mean, like, historically, all these people, the first Aga Khan, I mean, there were a ton of people that have killed more than 10 million people. I would say probably, though, if I had to pick the worst person in history, Stalin would be right up there. Stalin or Chairman Mao, maybe. I mean, Mao's numbers, 30, 40 million. You guys might correct this as historians, but I mean...
They're saying like 50. Some people say 50. So
yeah, if Mao killed 50 million people and kept communism alive to the point where it endures after the Russians collapsed, I mean, I'd have to put Mao right up there at the top of the list. I mean, like that would be, and that's before you get into the philosophers, of course. Like, I mean, Marx is someone who I think's done an incredible amount of damage. You could argue some of their religion.
We didn't even talk about that.
Yeah. But among Kshatriya, like warriors, probably Mao, then Tamerlane.
Well, Marx was a theorist. He wasn't actually.
His theories caused the destruction of a lot of
on the shoulders of giants.
People.
Marx didn't. Engels. There's Frederick Engels. There's Marx. There's. I mean, it's not like that wasn't his.
Well, the French Revolution, all that stuff.
It wasn't his his idea to begin with. He did a lot of reading as well, and then theorized or created his own systematic government as well.
Right. So you say, well, that your main focus is early America. That's your favorite historical time period?
Well, I would say that one of the areas that I'm very the Mongols are actually probably top 5 for me too. Like, all these lists are pretty fluid, but I mean, I would say that early pre-colonial and immediately post-colonial America is the Americas is something that I'm very interested in historically.
Right.
And I mean, like, military history in general, which is kind of one of those quirky guy interests. Like, I just read Victor Davis Hanson's Carnage and Culture, where he talks about the West versus the Great Eastern Empire. So I mean, there's a 100-page account in there of Gaugamela, like Alexander versus Darius. So I'm pretty, history in general is a fascinating topic. And
is that book a good read?
Yeah,
exactly.
It's well worth reading.
That's on my list. I've been wanting to. I like Victor Davis Hanson. He was on Tucker the other day, and apparently it was going pretty viral on Twitter. I saw, or X, but. Yeah. Okay. So I'm same way with you. And the funny thing is like, I majored in history in college. We didn't even I didn't even learn that much about history in high school or college as much as I've learned from something like hardcore history or reading books now. Like, we didn't have time to get to a lot of the stuff because history is so vast. Like, I don't know that I knew hardly anything about the Mongols until I listened to Hardcore History, and then I started reading about it, and I'm like, it's so fascinating. It is top 5, right? I mean, the people were fighting knights and samurai at the same time, and knights didn't know samurai existed, and samurai didn't know knights existed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's only 800 years ago. It's crazy.
I mean, I think that basic model of, most of feudal history, like when people talk about the Confederacy as a unique evil, not at all. Even if you consider it an evil, it was a very ordinary evil. It was a feudal system. So, I mean, like, for most of history, you had the Baron or the Count or the Carl, Massa. A lot of those terms, patron, they mean master, as you guys know. But I mean, you had him in a big ass house, and you had his wife, and he had like 8 kids. And then around that house, you had the nice brick houses, the kind of the men-at-arms, the retainers. In America, they would have been the cowboys, or the people who ended up becoming the Klansmen after their masters were defeated, that kind of thing. And then you had a bunch of poor SOBs who'd been captured in war who were digging in the ground. And I mean, that's what slaves and for a long time Irishmen did in America. But it's
serfs.
Yeah, exactly. Serfs in Europe. Yeah. And so that model of like guy with a bunch of metal on and a big sword who's keeping the Vakis in line, I mean, is pretty universal. So the knight and the samurai, very similar. And I assume when the Mongol cavalryman went home, he whipped his captured Cossacks around enough to get the herd driven out to pasture in the barley grown. So
yeah, exactly.
Probably, most likely.
Same. Yeah, I mean that's what I try to explain to people when I have arguments like this about that stuff. When they talk about how America is based on an evil, and it's the worst place, and it's obviously they don't understand any about a history. That's why I think your new book might be interesting. We were talking about this before we went live, but you have the new book "Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me" coming out hopefully this winter. Is that something you address in that book, like how we don't talk about any of that historical facts that were true everywhere else?
Yeah, it's actually the main theme of the book. So if I can give like a brief intro there. I mean,
please.
There's a whole series of books that have come out in the USA over the past 40 years that are considered mandatory reading for an educated American, like Lies My Teacher Told Me, for example. Howard Zinn's different work in the Zinn curriculum, Zinn educational curriculum, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And a theme of a lot of this stuff is kind of like what they're telling you is a lie. So they take like the old Jingo curriculum that was taught in the North in the USA through maybe the 50s, or South in the USA through maybe the 70s. And they'll look at that and they'll say that a lot of things in there, like Mexicans and Native Americans were uncivilized and there weren't very many Native Americans, the old Alamo myth. Like that's not true. Okay, sure. But I mean, Mexico, in fact, didn't have slavery when we did. They were one of a very few countries that had abolished that. I mean, many of the native tribes were mound builders, pyramid builders, lived in cities. Okay, cool. But that point has become almost the de facto go-to on kind of the center left for decades. Like, aha, but did they teach you about slavery? And the point that I make in this book is, yes, like for 60 years, the other political side has been in charge of the colleges, the media, the high schools.
Right.
You can like that or not, but to like look at CNN and say that's the Republicans lying about enslavement is absurd. It's just fantasy. Right. So one of the points that keeps getting made in the book, and this wasn't my intent originally, but is that the things that were evil about the USA were evil pretty much everywhere. While a lot of the things that were unique about the USA, or indeed the civilized New World states, were new to the world and were good. So like I have a chapter on slavery, and I point out that one of the first human words was slave. Like the Sumerian word for, slave and enemy, they're very similar. Slave is defeated enemy, which tells you a lot about how humans formed languages. But there's like a word that's a guy standing in front of a mountain with shackles on, because their opponents were like the Zagros mountain tribesmen. So when they lost a battle, the Sumerians would round them all up and cut off one ear, and then they'd be building temples or whatever. So this practice through Greece, through Rome, Arab enslavement of blacks, Arab enslavement of whites. By the way, the Arab city and trading states gave the world the terms for both slave, white slave, Slav, and black slave, Abid. And both are still widely used in the Arabian world as just descriptions of people in those races. But I mean, moving on, Aztec slavery, like slavery went on for almost all of history. And it was almost all what's called chattel slavery. Like you could buy and sell slaves. What else would you do with a slave? I mean, without being cynical, like you would make them work or you would sell them. The Arabs claim that they were more humane to captured blacks and whites. Like there's not a population of brutalized descendants. But the reason for this is that they tended to modify them physically. So, I mean, there were all these eunuch surgeries that were performed for captured African or European soldiers.
Right.
So, I mean, that's one of the points, that the idea that we don't talk enough about this, or that slavery was unique to America and to the West, is absurd. What's actually unique to America and to the West is ending slavery. Like the British Royal Navy blockaded much of Africa at the cost of tens of thousands of lives for decades.
And hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money, correct? I mean, like they spent treasure on treasure to end slavery without really seeing a financial benefit in it. That wasn't the point. There was no planned financial windfall at the end.
It was a moral high ground, but we still have slavery in Africa today. That's the interesting part.
Yeah. Well, that's what you're saying. I agree with you. In the West, we've built this culture where the idea of slavery itself is abhorrent, but historically that's not accurate. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to argue with people about that. Like, what are you talking about? We didn't invent slavery. We didn't invent any of these evils, but the West put in these structures, started this trend of structure of a form of freedom and liberty where the idea of slavery was going to be a counter. It was inevitable because it ran counter to the very ideas that we were founding the country on.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple of different things there. First of all, because the Western countries were more democratic, although it wasn't saying much in Britain in the 1850s, you still had a ruling king and so on, but more democratic relatively than Shaka's court or something. But I mean,
Right.
because they were more democratic and because they came out of the Christian Renaissance tradition, there was this sort of public square where people could just argue that things were wrong. And I actually think this has a real downside as well. What Nietzsche, the dark but intelligent philosopher, called prey morality, where people become so obsessed with never hurting anything that they make
Right.
it impossible to sustain societies. Like only a Western society would consider opening its borders to its hereditary enemies. Like when you see France letting in actually quite civilized people, but the people from the other side of the Crusades, like
Right.
people from like the northern coastal Libyan cities, like that's nuts. That's the downside of excessive moralizing in that public space. But the upside is that you do have a continuing moral tradition, just like we had a continuing scientific tradition in the West, as opposed to kind of a lot of brilliant but almost rote learned tricks in a lot of China and Arabia, perhaps. So because of that conversation, people were able to come forward and say, I'm an abolitionist. We need to get rid of slavery. Like it's messed up. There's a slave market across the street from the church. Whereas if
Right.
you asked like a mercantile or noble class Arab of that era, how do you feel about the fact there's a slave market down the street from the mosque? He would just say, well, they lost. There would not be that kind of constant competition where you'd need to talk about this. Like, yeah, we beat the blacks in the last war, so we got a bunch of them over here. You want to buy one?
Sometimes they get us. Yeah. Sometimes they get
exactly.
us, and that's part of the cost of doing business. And it is
Yeah.
the strength and the weakness. You're right. It's the strength and the weakness.
And this was taken by all of the other poles of civilization, which I would describe as India, China, Arabia, to some extent Ethiopia and West Africa. Certainly don't forget those, coming from an HBCU perspective. But I mean, all of that, Eastern Europe is versus Western Europe. The other pole, the Aztecs and Incas, I guess, would have certainly been competitive had they had metal technology. But I mean, in all of those other societies, there were different moral traditions, and they included the idea that full justice would come either after life, karma, or that where you were in this life was a result of things that had happened in the past or of your own strategic decisions here. So there wasn't that kind of overarching some things are just good framework. Like when you
Right.
said the Arabs and the civilized blacks were both just like, yeah, sometimes they get us. Yes. Like there was an entire conflict called the Zanj Wars that's been largely forgotten. But I mean, this is like 650 to 700 AD, something like that, where the black tribesmen from the Bantu city-states that had been captured by the Arabs were brought to Iraq. And they were just kind of made to clean out this salt marsh. And this went on for decades. And eventually there were enough of them there that they rebelled, and both sides just committed atrocities, and reinforcements came for other places. And it's sort of
Right.
that Trojan War kind of situation. Like no one debated the ethics of the situation. It was just like,
Yeah.
well, if we win, we'll be free and we'll probably take some Arab slaves.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's human history until just recently. And we
Yep.
should be thankful we're living now in a place where that's still not going on, because that does. And that's the danger of not appreciating what we have, because then you risk throwing it out and we end up not having it anymore.
Yes.
And I think, and to expand on that, I think a lot of people in Western civilization are so far detached generationally from from how the world used to be, that I don't know. They're trying to vilify just everything within the modern lens. I mean, vilify history from the modern lens.
How much of that do you think is the natural cultural philosophy, town square, like you're talking about, and how much of it is capture by educational institutions and things like that. Do you think that plays a large part in this over moralizing and things like that?
Well, I think that over moralizing is a weakness of the Judeo-Christian moral philosophies in general. So, like, I mean, I was raised as a Catholic, and I mean, I suppose what's the old line? Like, do you believe in the watchmaker and walk in the light? Like, I'm not an evil person, but I mean, I think that a lot of Western religious teaching isn't true. I mean, in an empirical sense. I mean, there are famous critiques of literal readings of the Bible that I don't need to go through. And I think that when those things are combined with the almost feminized society, as ours is becoming, there are advantages to that, into a more macho society, you get an excessive level of empathy that I don't think, for example, Constantine or St. Augustine would have thought necessary as a Christian. And so I think there are a lot of forces there. There's the lack of real danger in society, the over-feminization of society. And again, that has some upsides too. First wave feminism was pretty necessary. But there's the kind of watered down version, the non-muscular Christianity and Judaism that most Americans follow. But part of that certainly is something that doesn't help is I don't think this ties into the inherent weakness of Judeo-Christianity, I guess I'm saying, but something that doesn't help is the fact that many American institutions have been overtaken by people that hate the country. I mean, I absolutely think that's relevant. So the schools, for example, will teach about the legitimate enough atrocities of the USA. You shouldn't sell crying mothers' babies to their enemies and so on. Of course, it's bad. But I mean, in any non-sociopathic human would probably say that's right at the boundary of what I can tolerate empathically or beyond it, given today's level of training. Like, of course. But the teaching is done in a very targeted, very specific way, which, as we've already said, omits any discussion of the exact same thing happening everywhere else. And I also think it's done with intent. Like, the idea of a lot of Western far leftists is that the West is bad and should be destroyed. And by this, I don't think they mean, it's not the crazy online conspiracy theories like they're going to kill all the white people. It's sort of like we would do things like form a territorial union with all of South America. Or borders should be eliminated, or half of the criminal laws should be taken off the books. So the reason that we're hearing so much about our ancient evils, some even real, is that there's a goal there. Like, so how can a country that's done all this not pay reparations? And I personally just find the entire argument to be disingenuous bullshit. All countries did these things that we now consider bad. We led the fight to get rid of them. And there also are some questions that are really awkward, but that have to be asked, like, are Black, or for that matter, Sicilian or Irish people, worse off in the USA than they would be had they remained in their equally violent home country? And the answer is just objectively, obviously, no.
No.
So the reason that the constant guilt mongering is going on is to avoid those real conversations.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Well, and then why is nobody why isn't there, or is there, a lot of pushback in academia to confront this narrative? Because I'm not seeing, I like, you're not seeing a lot of professors being canceled or try to be canceled for having the opposite opinion of what is a common base narrative in the collegiate system. So I'm not seeing professors, protest and say, hey, this is all nonsense, you're teaching bullshit, and we need to, we need to get back to a level playing field. I mean, do you see any of that pushback? I mean, there's some, but I'm not seeing any professors do that.
Well, he is.
Or are you?
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, so I think to answer that, I think there are a couple different levels. So first of all, I mean, I think there's fairly substantial pushback to a lot of this gibberish, sometimes subtle. But like, so for example, I'm a member of 1776 Unites, which is a group that was specifically established as the Black sort of business and social science community, at least from the right of the center right. But our response to the 1619 Project, which is just ahistorical nonsense in many cases. And so, I mean, the board there is pretty on par with any think tank I could imagine. I mean, we've got Glenn Lowry, Walter Williams, I believe, was on the masthead, Carol Swain, John McWhorter, myself, Coleman Hughes. I mean, multiple people, John Sibley Butler, who's one of the country's better known historians, at least within his field. I mean, probably 1,000 publications just from the top 20, 30
It just doesn't get covered in the mainstream media, so then it doesn't pick up the same.
That's a big problem. But also, like, I would say there's a part two there, one of the points is just that on average, when you look at VDH, Victor Davis Hanson, or you look at Glenn Lowry, conservative professors, I would say, perform well above average. But there's a reason for that. It's kind of like, black guys in the NHL or white guys in the NBA. Like, you kind of have to be good because there's probably an initial entering question of what's this guy doing here, right?
Right.
So academia, last I looked, leans about 93. We're talking about the social sciences. Leans about 93 or 94% to the right, which is insane.
Right.
So does the media, by the way. It's a famous study from Pew
You mean
in 2004. The left.
You mean left? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Academia and the media lean about 93 to 94% left. And that's pretty much undisputed. I mean, Pew did that in 2004. What are the feelings of national media non-sports journalists, I believe? And 7% of them were conservatives. And that includes libertarians, center-right, which is what I am, so on. And it's probably accurate, like last line, but to say that, the other 93% included leftists and liberals and left-leaning moderates or whatever. But when you have figures like that, like where would the opposition come from? That's why so many people like Colin Wright are outside of the academy now.
Well, and that's the reason why I brought that up is I had a professor who specifically told me that she was conservative, but she couldn't even have discussions with her colleagues who were left-leaning because she'd be shouted down, called, like a terrible person, or, you're advocating for slavery or violence or anything like this. And basically she was just shouted down until she just stopped talking. And I just, that's why I was curious. I mean, yes, there's the big names, but, if 94% of your colleagues are on the opposite side of the fence,
there's a lot of peer pressure there.
What does the other 6% do?
Right.
Well, yeah. I mean, so that was going to be kind of the final point I was going to make there. Like, yeah. So first, obviously, there are people speaking out. Secondarily, and their entire organizations like FIRE. FAIR has hit some issues, but I mean, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism done some very good things. I mean, 1776 United. I mean, they're nationally known groups that hold conferences and so on. Quillette has a relationship with a lot of heterodox academic. But I mean, beyond that, the 6% of the population, not only do they have to research a little harder so you keep that job, and not only do they have the same interests other faculty members do, but if you're in a group, and I've been fortunate enough not to experience this really at a Southern college and so on, but if you're in a group of people where everyone else thinks you're a racist Nazi, I mean, it probably is pretty difficult to express your views at, a tea time panel or a keynote speech or the sort of things you normally do.
Or even in the break room.
Of Bruce Gilley, who wrote The Case for Colonialism, which is one of the better empirical papers I've read recently. I made the point that, if you were living in a Stone Age level of technology, being conquered by the Brits would probably improve your overall life prospects, which is obviously true. And the response to that, the journal that he wrote for, the Third World Quarterly, I believe, got death threats. Like, people from India were calling the editor and say they were going to kill him and rape his wife and so on, and other countries as well. And they took down the paper. I mean, when you're dealing with stuff like that, I grew up in a pretty hood neighborhood and was in the actual business world before academia, so I think some of it's funny. I mean, I have a gun. But if you're just a normal, glasses wearing professor and you're hearing this kind of crap, you might think look, I just want to research insects. I don't want crazy guys coming by my house.
Right. I don't want to get involved. It's too much drama. Now, I don't know, how much of this do you think is perpetrated because is there foreign actors, back in the 50s or 60s that really started this trend in academia? Like, Rogan always plays this interview from the Soviet defector in the 80s, and he was talking about how their plan was to get U.S. professors to be communists, basically, and teach anti-American, teach the young people to hate the country, and that was how they were going to bring down America, right? And you play that interview, and it's literally from the 80s, and you're like, holy crap, this guy sounds like they did it. Yeah. Have you ever seen that?
I wonder about that. So first of all, I think it's obviously possible that could happen. Something I was very interested in during the era when we had all the different Black Lives Matter groups, Patrice Cullors, Sean King, all these people that frankly struck me as grifters,
right?
That were getting tens of millions of dollars. Black Lives Matter, all in all, across the top 90 or so organizations, grossed $11.3 billion. That's a stat from The Economist, and I believe 2022. It's again utterly uncontested. But I mean, you do wonder, like, if I were the government of China and I'm seeing these riots going on across the country, and like in Kenosha, like conservative MAGA guys and, you know, black face mask protesters were literally fighting in the streets. Several people were killed. Wouldn't you sponsor that? Like, wouldn't we be helping out their dissidents, Tiananmen Squad 2 or something like that?
Yep.
And so I'm sure that money does come in. I mean, it's a well-known fact that the hardcore U.S. peace movement, which produced a lot of academics, by the way, in the 70s and 80s, was funded primarily by the Russians. Like, we've since been able to look at the sources for these groups. And part of the reason for that was that the Russians wanted to devalue our army, like talk young men out of joining it. And they also wanted to prevent the USA from developing nuclear power, which one could be used for better bombs, but also two would make us less dependent on those giant oil fields in Europe and even in Russia itself. And that obviously worked. Like, there's still this crazy 3 Mile Island idea today on the left that you're going to get Godzilla if you have clean nuke like they do in France. So I wouldn't be surprised. I've never investigated it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating interview they had. It was on I think it was on 60 Minutes or something sometime in the 80s. But yeah, then you look, I've read a book about Howard Zinn, who you mentioned earlier, and how there's a lot of ties to him to actual communists from Russia. And then he wrote the book that basically started a lot of this going down that path, right?
Yeah,
So
well,
it's
Vin
interesting.
is an open communist, as I understand. He's a Marxist.
Right.
I mean, so, yeah, like the communist. This is actually another chapter of the book, not just to keep plugging the book, but
Please.
like,
Oh no, please!
I'm excited for the book, so keep telling us about it.
fair enough. But like, so one of the chapters is just like the Red Scare wasn't a scare. Like, we were actually in almost a nuclear war with Russia. This is the basis of the James Bond franchise. Like, there were spies all over the damn place. So like almost everyone that was accused of being a communist spy was a communist spy. Like, I would encourage anyone listening to this in either of our audiences just to Google the phrase Venona cables, Venona. We have the captured encrypted transcripts from the Soviet government to their agents. And they mention a lot of just random people, like Winston Churchill's in there. He's referred to as like Wild Boar. You know, Roosevelt is like Capitan, you know. But they're the people like Alger Hiss, the Rosenbergs, so on down the line that like became these cause celebs. Trumbo, you know, the government's trying to say I'm a commie. Like, they were all communists. Like, most of them were actually recognized Russian agents that had Russian code names and handlers. So, yeah, I think we're kind of saying the same thing here. I definitely think that the original peacenik movement, hippie movement, the first wave of radical professors that went to the colleges, the Russians would have been insane if they didn't try to slip them some money or turn them
It's
with
a
honey.
brilliant move.
Yeah.
Look at how much money, like you said, the nuclear. They're still pushing the anti-nuclear environmental stuff. They're still backing those groups, and then so how much money has that saved them? Right, it's selling all that oil. If most of the Western world was clean nuclear power right now, Russia would be so much more impoverished. So that was probably really money well spent.
Well, also, do you think that to expand on that, I wonder how much Russian money goes into the federal government for them to decide what oil to extract or what oil, or environmentalist groups,
sure,
like the shale oil in the Rockies, that we're not allowed to tap,
right?
Things like that. I'm just curious how much.
How much
all
that
plays
stuff.
a factor.
Okay, so thanks we want to be respectful of your time, but I want to give you a chance here. Is there a historical subject that you don't get to talk about that you want to talk about? Is there some kind of historical fact that you want everybody to know that nobody talks about, or throw it to you? What do you want to talk about history-wise?
Well, there's no historical subject that people really prevent me from talking about. I mean, the main historical fact that I would emphasize would be almost something jokingly like history sucked. Like, I think that there's a tendency on the right, especially. I see this with a lot of my Caucasian buddies in particular, to romanticize the past because, like,
froze up. Sorry, go ahead. It froze for a second. It froze at history sucked. It'll keep going.
Yeah,
yep.
the way this platform works, we should get through all this fine. But like the history sucked, I think, is an underappreciated phrase, especially on the right. I mean, where there's this idea, and you see this less among black guys because, great warrior history in Africa, but like we literally lost the war and came here, mostly descended from slaves. So it's kind of like, if you're a black dude, you don't really want to go back to like 1846, right? But I think there's this tendency to say, well, in the 1950s, things were bucolic, men were men and women were glad of it. The ethnic groups got along. History, it's a wonderful time. One of the things that I found researching the book, which I did very seriously and with the help of people that are pros or near that level in history and so on down the line, is that with limited exceptions, like the peak of the Roman Empire, most of history was absolutely terrible. Like the average woman was in our terms a battered wife. The average man didn't have it much better, if any better at all. He was a peasant or a one-eyed, low-paid mercenary soldier. And I mean, like, even when you think of those pleasant eras, like the 1950s with the sock hops and you kiss your girl afterward, I mean, it's worth noting neither of you would be wearing deodorant, in your air conditioner-less car while you're hooking up, which, no need for like R-rated jokes there, but just that was something that came into play in the 1960s, like along with grooming body hair, just all this different stuff, like 40% of toilets were outside,
indoor plumbing.
Yeah. But all that stuff, like there was a study of Southern IQ recently. I'm interested in kind of the group IQ debate. I think the differences are mostly cultural and environmental, blah, 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 if not entirely.
Sure.
But like there was a study that looked at why both black and white Southerners had lower IQs than identical populations of Northerners. And one of the reasons that they theorized very seriously was all the parasitic worms in the region. Like you would be infected with this like river blindness, Lassa fever type of shit. And you would be barely able to move. You could work like half the day and the rest of the time you'd sit around. You might be drinking whiskey to minimize the pain. So like not being eaten alive by parasitic worms. We're talking like
I think it was right. And I think it was ringworm too was another one. And it just one of the symptoms of that is your cognitive abilities suffer. And then if you get the anti-parasitic and you get rid of it, like you snap back. But how many people in the South, because it is a thing where if you're walking around barefoot in those kind of temperate climates, you get ringworm.
Well, I would push back a little bit, Will, and I would say it depends on what your economic output is to the region you're located. So I'm not knocking farmers here, but I would assume that you don't have to have as much knowledge or experience to farm. How about knowledge, general knowledge to farm as you would to fix complex machinery like during the Industrial Revolution. So maybe that would have something to do with it, or maybe I'm wrong, but I would assume what your trade or your local trades were as a whole would affect your IQ.
But I would think IQ test accounts for that, doesn't it? Doesn't it
No,
try to...
actually,
no?
Not really well. Like, so, I mean, I actually can answer that question if you want. I mean,
Please.
So
okay.
I personally think, like when I said I think IQ is largely cultural, as you guys know, there's a whole debate about this. It's sometimes called the cult crit hered debate. Some people think that group differences in IQ between, like, so American blacks right now test is 91, whites a little over 100. Hispanics about around the black average. Charles Murray put it at 93 in his most recent book, which also noted the black average was up. Native Americans about the same as blacks, blah, blah, blah. One explanation is that those differences are genetic. And there's an attempt to prove this in politically incorrect countries like China and Nigeria using GWAS analysis, like genetic testing and scanning. Another position argues that group differences are due to racism, like the tests are subtly biased against minorities, at least if they don't study to the Asian level. My perspective is that the differences are mostly what you could call cultural environmental. So, like, for example, Asians study about twice as much as blacks and Hispanics. Asians study about twice as much as some Hispanic groups that are almost genetically identical to Asians that are descended from, people who came across the Bering Strait. So it strikes me as hard to believe that there's a massive genetic difference between like a Korean guy, an Aztec guy, a Scotsman, and a Nigerian. Like those differences in IQ, which can reach like 30 points between those groups, are almost certainly due to things like being taught to read. So like if you, at the most basic level, like if you didn't know how to read, your score on like the Wechsler SAT verbal board would be a 0. Like it sounds stupid, but it's just real. Like you would look at the letters and then you'd like try to eat your pencil, try to figure out what's going on. And then you just throw the thing away and wander off in disgust. So yeah, like I think that the part of the difference might be that the South was the rural agrarian region. You go to school like 3 months out of the year, and so on down the line. And I mean, in between, like the poor white and black kids would play ball together. I mean, the South still produces many of the country's greatest athletes. I mean, people joke about American blacks and quote unquote rednecks being good athletes, big baseball playing, meat eating guys. So some of that probably played a role. But my point about the worms was just that you saw a jump in IQ of like 8 points when they started taking this medicine. So even if there's still like a 5 point or whatever difference between the North and the South, like 2/3 of that just went away because history sucked. And when people started having shoes, like you didn't get worms in your feet, like walking through like the shit-filled fields, every day. So I mean, like these were the real problems of history. Like if you were a black
dysentery,
guy, Southern Irish guy, like your boss could whip you, until the past century if you were doing a poor job. Like there's an overseer on a horse. So that's what a lot of what history was.
Yeah, dysentery. Right. I mean, dysentery killed more people than war. Right. I think isn't that the thought? And then, and not only that, right? You think about history sucking. If you don't, you're right. That high tide of the Roman Empire, you do see the common person having a pretty high standard of living. But besides that, the average person's standard of living is so far beneath what we have here in the West now that we should all be insanely thankful to live here and now.
Well, I would push back a little bit on that one too.
Well, you don't like indoor plumbing?
No, hold on. The Romans had indoor plumbing.
That's what I'm saying, but that was like a high watermark, and that went away.
I understand, but life in the Roman Empire might be semi-comparable to what we have today, minus the air conditioning, I mean, they still had perfumes, they still washed.
They had public baths, they had a lot of that stuff. I mean, but they didn't have iPhones.
Yeah. like life in the Roman Empire would probably be very comparable to life in the USA, like circa 1910 or something like that. I mean,
sure.
One of the things, and that's one of the great human civilizations all time. I mean, probably only the Chinese are competitive historically. So I mean, like, but that's what I mean. Like, history moves in these cyclical peaks, and we're now at one of the high ones, at least in the past 5,000 years. One of my conspiracy theories, by the way, is that I think humans have risen and fallen many times before. Which would explain weird things like why aliens people say they encounter look like different types of human, or why there's that titanic layer of burnt volcanic glass like 30 feet under the ground across like a third of the world. Like we dropped our sun bombs on each other before. But I mean, like in the past, like known period, like since the oceans drank Great Atlantis or whatever the book opening is, like we are at probably the highest, or we're at the highest point. So
you think so?
Right. Since then, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, not since like humans were a spacefaring civilization, if that ever happened. I think it might have. Did. But like, yes, in the era that we know about, like, we are at the first or the second, probably the first highest all-time peak. And it's important that people recognize that. Like when people ask, like, what era of history would you rather live in? The one caveat here is like not knowing your rank. So like if you'd be a Roman emperor, where you could say, bring me 34 beautiful women that genuinely want to marry me, because I'm assuming like modern standards of consent, and then like, bring me a pound of opium and 2 elephants and serve the best meats of the land on golden dishes. Like that would be a more enjoyable life than probably anything you could do in the USA today.
That's accurate.
So I mean, like that is true. But the caveat there is that there's one emperor. So if you're just like the guy who's a small farmer and you're living in a decently well-built brick house and so on, the Roman would be quite pleasant, quite civilized, but there'd be a lot of things we have that they would never have considered, like televisions.
Antibiotics.
I guess so, other than like just raw alcohol that they'd pour in the wound,
Right. I mean, think about how many people died because they didn't have penicillin.
Yep.
Right. So I got to be respectful. I know you probably got to get going, but this is we've had a couple episodes where we talked about Graham Hancock and his theories, and what your conspiracy theory there seems like it's right in that Graham Hancock wheelhouse. And so that I thought that was interesting. But have you ever read Neil Howe's The Fourth Turning Is Here?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, he talks about the generations, the natural human succession of human generations, and how it leads to these seasons, about 20-25 years. And if you look at history, especially in the Anglo-American sphere, you get these big shifting trends every 20, 25 years, and every fourth one of those generations, you get a crisis. Just because of human nature, you're going to end up with the Revolution, the Civil War, the World War II, and then now we're in the fourth crisis. We're in the fourth turning in that crisis right now. So it's an interesting book. If you ever read it, let me know what you think, because I historically it sings true a lot. As much as he reaches sometimes, it really sings true.
I would describe it as more of like a cyclical sine wave for society.
Right.
So every 25 years, you're pulling out of, let's say you're at equilibrium, pulling up to a peak, and then the peak starts to drop, and then you drop below equilibrium, and then you hit your depression or, turning, and then all of a sudden you're back up into like, you're starting to rise again.
It's interesting.
But I think a lot of people take for granted, and I've said this on discussions with with a lot of communists and other people I decide to argue with online.
Will can appreciate that.
Yeah, but a lot of people do not appreciate how good their life is in Western, actually almost anywhere in the world, Western world specifically.
Right.
You have air conditioning, you have running clean water, you have indoor plumbing, you have typically a shelter, you have some form of shelter, you have heating. You're not scrabbling for food. It's readily available.
Calories are cheap.
Almost everybody. Yeah, you can.
1,000 calories cost you like $5. So.
Okay. Well,
Anyway.
Will, I just want to say thanks for having you on. And so your book's coming out this winter. Again, it's called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, and you can find his other books, Taboo, and I'll put a link to his Amazon page in the description.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Taboo
Will.
and Hate Crime Hoax. But yeah,
Yeah.
feel free to. One thing I would say about contacting me, the easiest way to find me is just to Google my name, which is Wilfred, it's Wilfred, Reilly, Reilly, and you'll find my Twitter, my old Facebook, website, all that stuff. So definitely reach out, and I'll talk to you.
That's great.